Okay. When system dialog pops up, it's not, come on. Nothing's popping up. Oh, here they are. Hi, everyone. Oh, there we are. I'm back there.
Now you can hear me? Can you hear me?
Hi.
You can hear me now?
Yes, sorry. We had some technical difficulties this morning. Oh, Kelly's behind me.
Erin's going to fill in for me, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties, and I will see you all later. I have another webinar.
Okay, we're all set to go. Sorry about that, guys.
Okie doke. All right, let me.
I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll go ahead and get those answered for you.
All right. Okay, picking up where we left off yesterday at page 6, paragraph 14, which is really a defining paragraph in the whole RPA and the whole transaction process. So this is the paragraph that defines our timeframes and all the process of contingency removal, along with buyers and sellers' rights to exercise contingency removal, demand for contingencies removal, and just maintaining the contract timeframes. So let's just start. I'm probably going to read a good bit of the paragraph, and we're going to spend a good bit of time today of today's session on this paragraph. So the time periods for removal of contingencies and cancellation rights. The following time periods may only be extended, altered, modified, or changed by mutual written agreement, and any removal of contingencies or cancellation under this paragraph by either buyer or seller must be exercised in good faith and in writing. And the contingency removal, you're going to use CAR form CR. If it's cancellation, it's CAR form CC. So by default, seller is going to have 7 days after acceptance to deliver to the buyer anything that seller has agreed to take responsibility for. And the paragraphs we covered yesterday covering the statutory and other disclosures will come into play here. So seller has 7 days to get those to us, as well as any report seller has agreed to provide, such as a structural pest report. Anyway, that's supposed to come to the buyer within 7 days after the acceptance of the purchase agreement. Buyer then, by default, has 17 days after acceptance, and that's for buyer to complete all investigations, including the review of all of the disclosures, including any reports that has been provided to the seller, provided to the buyer, like a pest report or natural hazard disclosure report. If the property is an investment property, then they're taking it with the existing tenant, then it would be lease documents and all of the related documents to the rental property, if that's what they're purchasing. So it's default of 17 days, and also within that time frame, buyer is going to be conducting any buyer inspections, such as a whole house inspection, and then any ancillary inspections that are recommended by the whole house inspector. Remember, I think we alluded yesterday to the fact that the whole house inspection is essentially like going to your general practitioner and then being sometimes referred to specialists if there are certain concerns that need further investigation by someone who specializes in, say, in the case of a house, roof, or should get a chimney inspection or a sewer inspection, those kinds of things. Now, because a whole house inspector may very well be recommending ancillary inspections, it's really a good idea not to dilly-dally around when you are have gotten your acceptance and are getting your inspections scheduled. I like to, in an ideal world, if buyer is taking responsibility for conducting the pest inspection, I like to do that first. And the reason is, in San Diego County, there are many, many really fine pest companies that will do the inspection report for no charge. And even those who charge, the cost usually doesn't exceed $100. I like to get that done first, especially if the buyer is particularly sensitive on termite issues, because some buyers would not go further based on the amount of damage to the property that might be present due to wood destroying pests. So ideally, I would like to have that report first, but sometimes I would schedule on the same day both the pest inspector and the whole house inspector. And again, you're going to be coordinating that with the listing agent and seller, making sure they're informed and that you're not walking into the middle of somebody's birthday party for a home inspection. Anyway, get that all coordinated, but do it soon because you may need to look into getting further inspections or perhaps cost bids on things in order for the buyer to make the decision to proceed with the transaction. Okay, so the default is 17 days. Often, or it's not uncommon to have that countered down to a smaller number of days. I've seen some really, really small ones lately, really small number of days being allowed, which is not terribly reasonable. If you were to get someone countering with 3 days for buyer inspections, that I would counter back on that. I did see one of those fairly recently, but it's not unreasonable. Bank-owned properties, short sale lenders always cut that down to the buyer inspection period down to 10 days, in my experience. You might want to shorten it going in to maybe something like 12 days, but everything is situational. If you have a buyer that's out of town and you need a little bit more time, you wouldn't want to be shortening up your inspection timeframes. So within the time frame, moving down to B2, 14B2, within the time frame that has been agreed upon there, specified, buyer may request that seller make repairs or take any other action regarding the property. And the form to be used for that is CAR Form RR, request for repairs. Now, this is really, really crucial and really important that you explain to buyers, because seller has no obligation to agree to or even respond to your request for repairs. They don't even have to say pound sand or we got this. But if they're going to respond, they're going to use CAR Form RRRR. I will say and that's seller's response and buyer's to buyer's request for repairs. So I will say I have never had a case where it was just, crickets, silence, no response at all. But it does say here, the seller doesn't even have to respond. So buyers will say, will ask you when they're doing the request for repair, how long do they have to respond? Or do they have to do this? Or they'll think that they have, the seller has to do what they request, or that the seller has to do health and safety items or things of this nature. Seller does not even have to say, we received your request for repairs. Okay. Now, by the time specified in B1, which is buyer's inspection time frame, or as otherwise specified in the agreement, buyer shall deliver to seller a removal of the applicable contingency or a cancellation. So buyer's rights, once they do their inspections and have received disclosures and reports and reviewed all of that, buyer's options are to say, okay, good, now we're informed, we're going forward. Or they can say, well, we're really concerned about these items and we would like to request that the seller repair those items. And, or they can just say, yeah, this is too much for us. We're out and we're canceling. And they're canceling in that scenario within their rights, and they're entitled to receive their earnest money deposit back. This is a common fear of buyers in putting up the earnest money deposit, that they think people are trying to take their deposit money. They have so many, contingency and rights within the contract that their earnest money deposit is not at risk until they have in writing, using CAR Form CR, signed the removal of the contingency. So if buyer is canceling for cause, based on the results of their inspections, they are entitled to receive their earnest money deposit back. They just need to send over the CAR Form CC. I had one yesterday, a question where the buyer had a few things, maybe $1,000 or so worth of stuff. They wanted to do a request for repair, and the agent, our agent, called the listing agent, who then called back and said the seller's going to cancel. The seller doesn't want to do the repairs, and seller's going to cancel. Well, guess what? Seller can't just randomly cancel prior to the end of buyer's inspection period. So that was an idle threat. Anyway, in that case, buyer decided, $1,000 worth of stuff, not worth it. We'll just keep moving forward. Seller, this paragraph is really important because it defines those rights. Seller can't just say, well, we think we sold the house too cheap, so we're going to cancel, or whatever it is that their concern might be, or we don't want to do those repairs, we're going to cancel. Seller cannot cancel just based on those kinds of things. There are seller cancellation rights, and we will get to those a little further down here. So buyer is supposed to, within the time frame, deliver a contingency removal or cancellation. Now, this is also really important. If any report, disclosure, or information for which seller is responsible is not delivered within the time specified in 14A, then, which is 7 days for seller, then buyer has 5 days after delivery of any such items, or the time specified in 14B1, whichever is later, to deliver to seller a removal of the applicable contingency or cancellation of this agreement. So let's say the buyer got countered on the 17-day inspection period and accepted let's just say 12-day inspection period. If all of seller reports are delivered to buyer by day 7, which is the time frame allotted for the seller, then by day 12, buyer has had their 5 days for review and would be subject to getting the contingency removed. If there's something that doesn't come till day 11, that particular item, the contingency is not removed on that item until day 16. So, that buyer cannot be forced to remove that contingency until they've had 5 days to review anything that was not received within the 7-day time frame. Now, continuation of contingency, there is no passive contingency removal in the California Residential Purchase Agreement. We agree upon the timeframes that are enforceable, but the passage of those timeframes does not in itself remove the contingency. So even after the end of the time specified in 14B1, which is buyer inspection timeframe, and before seller cancels, if at all, and that'll be pursuant to 14D, which we're getting to, buyer retains the right in writing to either remove the remaining contingencies or cancel this agreement based on a remaining contingency. So once buyer's written removal of all contingencies is delivered to seller, seller may not cancel this agreement pursuant to 14D. So what this means then is the contingency runs even after the expiration of the time frame until it is removed in writing by buyer. Seller does have some remedies we're getting to, but if the buyer is dilly-dallying around about getting contingencies removed, there are actions the seller can take to force that or cancel themselves if seller is inclined to do that. Now, this does say buyer shall have access to the property to conduct inspections. The default time frame is for 17 days after acceptance, whether or not any part of buyer's investigation contingency has been waived or removed. Now, this one I don't recommend doing, removal of contingencies with offer. There may be some isolated circumstances where you would do that. When things were really, really heated up in 2013, 2014, 2015, there were training companies that were recommending checking this removal of contingencies with offer to say we're going to buy the house no matter what, and removing contingencies. I really strongly advise against this. It might get your offer accepted, but it might land everybody in court as well. I think buyers should make informed purchase decision after conducting inspections, and removing the contingencies with the offer takes that away. So to me, that's broker's worst nightmare. Now, seller's right to cancel and buyer contingencies. If by the time specified in the agreement, again, that would be paragraph 14B1, buyer does not deliver to seller a removal of the applicable contingency or cancellation of this agreement, then seller, after first delivering to buyer a notice to buyer to perform, which is CAR Form NBP, may cancel this agreement. In such event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit except for fees incurred by buyer. And usually those are, I've very seldom seen any fees collected by, say, an escrow company for things that services that have already been rendered. In any case, again, right here, it's clearly stated that if seller cancels the agreement, seller is returning buyer's earnest money deposit. So again, it's built right in here. They're not able to just take your deposit. Again, a common buyer fear. Okay, seller's right to cancel. So buyer can't just hold the house hostage. Let's say, for instance, the buyer does their inspections, puts forth a request for repair. Seller has not agreed to buyer's repair request, and buyer won't cancel or sign a cancellation. And it used to be buyer could just essentially hold the house hostage. So they've improved this, giving seller rights. So seller, after first delivering the NBP, may cancel the agreement. So what happens is they send the notice to buyer to perform specific to the contractual action they're requesting to be performed. This gives a list of, common things like maybe the buyer didn't deposit their earnest money deposit as required by paragraph 3A, and the default there is 3 business days, or they did make the deposit, but the funds were not good when deposited. There are a number of things listed here. The FHA or VA form that is required with a FHA or VA loan. So any number of things that the buyer, contractual action the buyer has not taken care of, the seller can demand that by the use of a notice to buyer to perform. So what happens when the notice to perform is issued? The NBP or NSP shall be in writing. It shall be signed by the applicable buyer or seller, and will give the other party at least 2 days. This is a default. I very seldom see this changed after delivery, or if it's otherwise agreed, to take the applicable action. And this is important. The notice to buyer to perform, notice to seller perform is a unusual circumstance, but there are cases where that does come up. I'll discuss those in a minute. A notice to buyer to perform may not be delivered any earlier than 2 days prior to the agreed upon expiration of the applicable time frame for the other party to remove a contingency or cancel the agreement or meet any other obligation. Okay, so a notice to seller to perform might come up if, let's say, you have a seller who has accepted an offer contingent on finding a suitable replacement property, for instance, and there's an agreed upon time frame for seller to do that and then remove that contingency so the buyer can know if they're moving forward or not with this purchase. So if the seller has not done that not removed the replacement property contingency within the time frame, then buyer can issue a notice to seller to perform. Sometimes sellers get toward the end and suddenly decide they don't want to sell after all, and then that would be a notice. Buyer might be issuing a notice to seller to perform for closing escrow, or signing the documents that need to be signed in order for escrow to be closed. But it's rare for a buyer to be issuing a notice to seller to perform, in my experience. Notice to buyer to perform, again, this can be done no earlier than 2 days prior to the expiration of the time frame. So here's the thing: if you have a 17-day contingency period and you are the listing agent, you can send the notice to buyer to perform for contingency removal on day 15. You can't send it any earlier than that. And what would be the point of sending it on day 15 instead of waiting till day 17, which is their day to remove the contingencies? Well, if you wait till day 17 and they have not removed the contingency, and you then on day 17 send the notice to buyer to perform, you have effectively extended the contingency period by 2 days. So depending on what's going on in the transaction, you may want to consider letting the listing agent know that it is your business practice to send the notice to perform 2 days prior to the expiration. And what does the notice to perform say? It simply says not that the transaction will be canceled if you don't remove the contingency. It just says seller may elect to cancel the transaction if buyer has not removed the contingency timely in the agreed upon time frame. So depending on the little nuances and the nuts and bolts of what's going on in your transaction, it may be something to consider. And people do tend to get upset when they receive a notice to perform. It's not a personal insult. It's taking care of business and protecting the interests of your client as a listing agent. That's the seller. So anyway, that's how that works. And when it says 2 days, that means on the second day following the issuance of the notice to perform, and the expiration would be at 11:59 p.m. On the second day. So if within that time frame, once the notice to perform has been issued, if buyer does send the contingency removal, which is generally going to be the thing that's being at issue or most common, if the buyer does deliver that contingency removal within that time frame, seller cannot cancel. Okay, so let's talk about the effect of buyer's removal of contingencies. If the buyer removes in writing any contingency or cancellation rights, unless otherwise specified in writing, buyer shall conclusively be deemed to have completed all buyer investigations, review of reports and other applicable information, and disclosures pertaining to that contingency or cancellation right. Buyer shall be deemed to have elected to proceed with the transaction and to have assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense for repairs or corrections pertaining to that contingency or cancellation right, or even the inability to obtain financing if something goes haywire and they suddenly can't get their loan and they have removed their loan contingency. Okay, close of escrow. Before buyer or seller may cancel this agreement for failure of the other party to close escrow pursuant to this agreement, buyer must first deliver to the other party a demand to close escrow, which is CAR form DCE. So for this purpose, you don't use the notice to perform. If it's closing escrow, you're going to use the DCE. The DCE shall be signed by the applicable buyer or seller and give the other party at least 3 days after delivery to close escrow. A DCE may not be delivered any earlier than 3 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow. Now, this form is used less frequently than the notice to buyer to perform, but if you have someone who is all aspects of the transaction have been completed, but for one reason or another, they're not prepared to close escrow, you would be issuing the DCE. And why is it 3 days? Because if the scheduled close of escrow date was a Friday and you can't close escrow on a Sunday, that's why it's not 2 days in the case of the demand to close escrow. And then also paragraph 30F covers this by rolling, if the last day for an event occurs on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, it rolls it forward. That paragraph in paragraph 30, I believe the section is section F, rolls it forward to the next day anyway. So, but this just clarifies if the issue is not having closed escrow, the form that you're going to use is the DCE. Now, what's the effect of the cancellation on deposits? If buyer or seller gives written notice of cancellation pursuant to rights duly exercised under the terms of this agreement, the parties agree to sign mutual instructions to cancel the sale and escrow and release deposits, if any. Now, in this case, it's to the party entitled to the funds. less fees and costs incurred by that party. Fees and costs may be payable to service providers and vendors for services and products provided during escrow, except as specified below. Let's see, I lost my place here. Release of the funds will require mutual signed release instructions from the parties. If that is not forthcoming, then it could be judicial decision or arbitration award that is required to get the disposition of the deposit determined. If either party fails to execute mutual instructions to cancel escrow, one party may make a written demand to the escrow holder for the deposit. This is CAR form BDRD or SDRD, and that is buyer demand for release of deposit or seller demand for release of deposit. The escrow holder, upon receipt of the BDRD or SDRD, shall promptly deliver notice of the demand to the other party. And if within 10 days after the escrow holder's notice, the other party does not object to the demand, escrow holder shall disperse the deposit to the party making the demand. If the escrow holder complies with the preceding process, each party shall be deemed to have released escrow holder from any and all claims or liability related to the dispersal of the deposit. Escrow holder at its discretion may nonetheless also require mutual cancellation instructions. And typically, if your client is issuing a cancellation of contract, CAR form CC, and that does get signed by all parties, that's a two-part form. The top part cancels the escrow. The bottom part deals with the disposition of the buyer's deposit. So if one party fails to sign that, they might be subject to, and there's no good faith dispute, they might be subject to a civil penalty of up to $1,000. And that's if there's no good faith dispute, just belligerence on the part of one party or the other. So back to, oh, shoot. There we go. Okay. Back to the good, if no good faith dispute exists, if there is a good faith dispute, say contingencies have been removed, and seller believes they are legitimately entitled to claim the deposit, and buyer refuses to sign the instructions, again, then buyer could be subject, in addition to forfeiting the deposit, a civil penalty of up to $1,000. Same with seller. If buyer is canceling within their rights that we've discussed over the course of reviewing this paragraph, the seller refuses to sign the cancellation or wants a part of buyer's deposit, they're not entitled to one dime if buyer is canceling within their rights. So you would be pointing out to the party who's dragging their heels about signing that they could be subject to a civil penalty, in addition to not getting the deposit anyway, or getting their deposit back pursuant to the having issued the BDRD or SDRD. So I'm going to stop at this moment and ask if there are any questions. Is anybody monitoring the questions?
I am monitoring and we have no questions.
Okay. All right. Know this paragraph and know what's contained within it. And, and if somebody issues you an idle threat of, oh, we're going to just, if you want repairs, we're just going to cancel the agreement, that's not what is contained here. And that's not what is contractually agreed to. So, all righty then. Now, paragraph 15, this deals with the final verification of condition. Buyer shall have the right to make final verification of the property within 5 days prior to close of escrow, not as a contingency of the sale, but solely to confirm that the property has been maintained pursuant to paragraph 11, which is it's maintained in substantially the same condition it was in at the time of acceptance. Any agreed upon repairs have been completed as agreed, and seller has complied with seller other obligation under this agreement. And the form that we use for this is CAR form VP, which is verification of property condition. Now, this is not, the walkthrough is not a time to go through and for the buyer to come through and say, oh, we didn't notice that before. We want them to fix this. Sorry, you didn't notice it before, unless it's something that occurred, say, during the seller's move out, like, you know, the movers banged a heavy antique armoire into the archway and put a big divot in the wall. Well, that would be something that the seller would be obligated to make a repair on, but not something that has been there all along that you just now noticed. So it's not a time to go through nitpicking on the property. You had your opportunity for inspections. It's simply a time to verify that the property condition is what it was at the time and that agreed upon repairs have been completed as agreed. Now, I had a lender once tell me a story that he found quite hilarious. I didn't find it funny at all. But one of the agents he worked with, a listing agent that he did some working with, had a property in Coronado, and there was a missing gate between the front and backyard, and the seller had agreed, as a result of the request for repairs, to install a gate with like-kind material similar to the gate on the other side and similar to the other fencing material. They go for their walkthrough 5 days prior to close of escrow, and the gate isn't there. So the buyer's agent, of course, brings this up with the listing agent, and they try to blow them off. In other words, it's like, we enticed you to continue with the transaction by saying we'd do these repairs, but guess what? Just kidding, we're not doing these repairs. Well, the buyer's agent, you know, persisted, as well he or she should have. And so the listing agent, the seller wouldn't do it. Again, at this point, it's kind of too late to get a credit for the buyer because of the lender requirements on closing disclosures. So the listing agent took an old cruddy 2x4, nailed a couple of boards to it, propped it up, and called that a gate. And this lender thought that was just hilarious. I don't find those kinds of things necessarily particularly hilarious. But again, you want to make sure the repairs have been completed as agreed. Sometimes your home inspector, if it's something that you have really no way of verifying, like, you know, junction box cover plates in the attic or things of that nature, some home inspectors for a fairly nominal fee will come back and verify for you that the repairs have been completed and the manner in which they've been completed is acceptable and done in a professional manner.
Hey, Andrea,
Yes.
a question did pop in. I wanted to catch you before you moved along too
Okay.
far. Is there a time limit for the other party to sign the CC?
There is not a time. That is a good question. There isn't really a time limit. So if you want, here's the time constraints. If you are the seller and the buyer is canceling within their rights, you want to sign that cancellation so you can get the property back on the market, because you can't make them buy the house. They're canceling within their rights, their contractual rights. So the sooner the seller signs, the sooner the seller can put the property back on the market. Now, they might sign the cancellation of escrow, but maybe not the disposition of the deposit. So the thing is, they can't really hold two deposits, though, on the same property, or one escrow company can't hold two deposits on the same escrow company. So no time limit, because it could be that the deposit is at issue, legitimately at issue, the disposition of the deposit. But it's in no one's best interest to receive a cancellation and not sign it if it's being signed within the what's prescribed in paragraph 14. Let's say a seller is canceling because buyer has issued a request for repair, seller has responded, buyer doesn't like seller's response, and seller responds by issuing, according to the guidelines herein, they issue their notice to buyer to perform for contingency removal, and buyer still doesn't remove it, and 11:59 p.m. on the second day after issuing the notice to perform comes around, seller can cancel at midnight. Seller then has a unilateral right to cancel, and they are, in that scenario, returning buyer's earnest money deposit. So yeah, it isn't governed necessarily by timeframes. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, now, paragraph 16, covering repairs. They shall be completed prior to final verification of condition unless otherwise agreed in writing. Repairs will be performed at seller's expense, may be performed by the seller or through others, provided that the work complies with applicable law, including government permit, inspection, and approval requirements. Repairs shall be performed in a good, skillful manner with materials of quality and appearance comparable to the existing materials. So that propped up gate certainly did not comply with this term of the contract. It is understood that exact restoration on cosmetic items may not be possible. Like you may not be able to exactly match, 20-year-old tile, for instance. Seller shall obtain invoices and paid receipts for repairs performed by others and prepare a written statement indicating the repairs performed by the seller and the date of such repairs. So they really are supposed to provide you all of this information. If they had someone else do it, you're supposed to get the invoices and receipts. And if they did it themselves, they're supposed to give you a written narrative of what they did and how they did it. And then all of that copies of invoices and paid receipts and statements are provided to the buyer. And that should occur prior to the final verification of condition. Now, one thing that sometimes and not infrequently actually happens with a request for repair, that instead of making all the repairs, the seller will agree to give a credit to the buyer in, whatever a reasonable amount of money or whatever is agreed upon to be a reasonable amount of money in lieu of the seller actually making the repairs. I personally prefer this method because you're kind of mind reading. If you're making the repairs, in some cases you might be mind reading as to how the buyer actually really wants it done. I think it's, for me, better. I prefer to do a credit. And again, this credit, after all of the request for repair and the response to the request for repair and all the back and forth has happened, and let's say seller is agreeing, I don't really want to do all these repairs, but I'll give you whatever the amount is, $2,000, $2,500. You would then be preparing an addendum, a plain old contract addendum. You're not ever going to send the lender any of these negotiations about repairs. You would just be doing a plain old white bread addendum that said simply, seller shall credit buyer $2,000 toward buyer's recurring and non-recurring closing costs at close of escrow, or whatever the agreed upon amount is. Now, if there was a preceding already agreed upon amount that seller had agreed to contribute to buyer's recurring and non-recurring closing costs at close of escrow. Let's say going into the transaction, they'd agreed to give the buyer $4,000 toward their closing costs. In the scenario where you are now adding what's essentially a repair credit, but cannot be stated as such, it needs to be stated as a closing cost credit, you would say in your addendum, seller shall credit buyer, if now they have the 4,000 from before, they have 2,000 more from their repair request negotiations, then you will say seller shall credit buyer $6,000 toward buyer's recurring and non-recurring closing costs at close of escrow. This credit is in lieu of and replaces any previously agreed upon seller credit. So make sure that it is clear that this is not $6,000 in addition to the previously agreed upon 4,000, but it's the total. But do not reference anything about in lieu of repairs in that addendum. And that's the addendum that goes to the lender. Remember, the lenders are packaging up their loans to sell, and anything that refers to any repairs that have not been completed are going to be make that loan not really saleable. So they want their loans packaged up in the way that is going to be acceptable to investors. And of course, the buyer, when they get that credit money, once they close escrow, they can make the repairs in the manner they choose and do it in the way that they is acceptable to them. Okay. Now, prorations of property taxes and other items. Unless otherwise agreed in writing, the following items shall be paid current and prorated between buyer and seller as of close of escrow. Sometimes you're going to get questions from buyers. I'll notice on the preliminary title report, there might be prior years of unpaid taxes, and they think that they're going to get saddled with the seller's unpaid taxes. No, the escrow company is going to bring the property tax payments current as of the date of close of escrow, and those items will be paid from the seller proceeds. Hopefully there's sufficient seller proceeds to cover all of that. This is why you actually read your preliminary title report when you receive it, and don't just check it off the list as one less thing to have to upload or follow up on. So real property taxes and assessments, interest, rents, HOA dues, all of those things are going to be prorated as of the date of close of escrow between buyer and seller. Now, bear in mind that when escrow is being closed, the proration on property taxes is going to be based on the existing property tax assessment. So if a seller purchased a property, let's say in 1980, and now and remember, in California that property taxes are based on the last sale price, so that let's say they purchased it in 1980 for $200,000. That's what their taxes, the property taxes, are based on. So now they're selling it in 2020, and they're selling it for, who knows, maybe $800,000. There is a big gap there between the old assessment and what the new assessment will be. So what the municipality will do is, when they get around to reassessing the property for the next tax year, they will also issue a supplemental tax bill. So when that is received by the buyer, they often think that somebody fouled up and didn't take care of tax prorations during escrow, but that is not the case. Escrow can only be closed on what's known now, which is the current tax installment. So that $600,000 gap between the $200,000 sale price that the property is currently being taxed on and the upcoming $800,000 sale price that new taxes will be based on, that is a significant gap that is going to result in a really good sized tax bill that is payable by the buyer. So, and that would be for the whatever portion of the current tax installment is remaining. So let's say they close on June 30th based on the old $200,000 assessment. Well, that means from July through December of this first installment of the upcoming 2020-2021 tax year, that 5 months of that will be based on $800,000. So the buyer is going to get, I mean, I can't do the math right now in my head, but the buyer is going to get a really an eye-popping tax bill that they're going to be unhappy about, but they need to be prepared for that. Now, if they're using an impound account, their lender may be collecting sufficient taxes to even as part of their monthly payments, and as also part of their setting up their impound account, may be collecting sufficient amount of tax money to cover at least a portion of that supplemental tax bill. But that is a common question that is often encountered. Buyers get that tax bill and think that it should have happened during escrow. And even when you explain this to them during the course of escrow, they forget by the time that tax bill comes out. So just be prepared to, remind them that this is just the way it works. Now, broker compensation and broker scope of duty. Again, the compensation is agreed upon to be paid. What is in MLS is what we are agreed as to accept as the cooperating broker. And it's also what the listing broker is obligated to pay us, no matter what. So if they're going to continue to be participants in the MLS. So if they're offering out a 2.5% broker co-op, that's what they're obligated to pay us. But at no point should an agent who's representing a buyer decide that they only work for 3% and therefore they're going to put it into the residential purchase agreement that the seller will pay them 3%. No reference to commission belongs in the purchase agreement. That would have to be a separate, they'd send over a cooperating broker compensation agreement and demand their 3%, but do not put it in the contract between buyer or seller or make that a condition of the acceptance of the purchase agreement. You know, broker compensation is not part of the contract between buyer and seller. So to make that clear.
Hey, Andrea,
Yes.
I have a question for you real quick that came up. Doesn't escrow provide a sort of pre-calculated amount for the supplemental tax bill for the buyer at closing?
I don't know if they give a calculation. I know that in the natural hazard disclosure reports, which also have taken upon themselves to disclose other statutory things like Mello-Roos bonds and so forth, they always have a calculator for the supplemental tax bill. So that you can get an estimate of it that way. Escrow could probably help you compile an estimate of what the supplemental tax bill will be, but you can do it yourself. The page in the NHD reports that contains that calculator gives you step by step on what figures you put where and what your multipliers are to help determine what your supplemental tax bill will be. But let's just take the $800,000 house, since our the tax rate, if there's no Mello-Roos and no other add-ons, the tax rate is going to be 1.2%. That means that the taxes are going to be $800 a month. And they were effectively something more like $200 a month on the $200,000 sales price. So that's a pretty good gap that's going to result in a pretty sizable supplemental tax bill. So, did that answer the question?
I believe it did. There was also a, oh wait, I'm sorry. One more came over. If a seller does not agree to my 3% compensation request, do I still need to represent buyer on that property, or do I suck it up for my buyer?
Now that's a good question. Basically, I would not personally. What's in the MLS is what I accept as the compensation, and sometimes you're even seeing now sometimes 2%. It's not not ideal from our standpoint, but I would personally, I'm there representing the buyer. This is the house for them. That's a compensation that's offered. I would not request a 3%. I wouldn't do that, because to me, that is putting my buyer at a competitive disadvantage over, if there's multiple offers, other potential buyers. And it's also perhaps impacting the way the seller is going to negotiate on, say, on price or other terms of the contract. And I just don't feel personally that that's my place to interject myself and my demands into the negotiation between the buyer and the seller. Personally, I would suck it up. And guess what? That buyer knows people who know people who they refer to you. Whereas if you make your compensation the primary focus of the transaction, I don't know, maybe you get your 3% on this transaction, but do you get any referrals going forward? Because if it's $1 million house, that might represent $10,000 in compensation to you that it lands up translating to a detriment to the buyer, because now the seller won't do repairs because they're paying you that extra $10,000, or they won't negotiate on the price on behalf of the buyer because they're paying you an extra $10,000. That's my personal personal opinion. There's not one right opinion. I certainly wouldn't dissuade a buyer from purchasing a house based on what the commission is or what the seller is agreed to pay, or whether or not the seller agrees to my request for additional compensation over and above what's offered in the MLS. That would be, in my opinion, a fiduciary breach, taking them away from the house they want because of my the size of my paycheck. That's how I see that. So.
Okay, thank you. Oh, and James says thanks as well. Another question that's kind of off topic here, but who pays arbitrators in a dispute?
Both parties have to pay for mediation and arbitration, and those are handled. Mediation is agreed upon. We'll be getting to that in paragraph 22, but it's default in the contract. We are agreeing in the event of a dispute to go to mediation, and then if mediation does not resolve, a resolution cannot be come to through mediation, then it becomes necessary to, if the arbitration paragraph is initialed, go to arbitration rather than litigation for resolution of the dispute. So both parties have costs to that. And if there's language in the paragraph that says the prevailing party may be awarded attorney fees and costs, but maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But oftentimes, if you win your arbitration, you will be also awarded your costs back from the party that did not win the arbitration. But up front, going in, there's no decision as to who's liable for what. So going in, both parties have costs in order to get the arbitration going.
Okay, that's all our questions for right now. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Representative capacity. This is important, and this is why you want to make sure when you're writing an offer to pull the property profile and see who the owner of record is. So if it's a trust, which is quite common in our area, or an LLC, then you're going to be using what we'll get to shortly, the representative capacity signature disclosure, and that's CAR form RCSD. There's an RCSD for sellers and RCSD for buyers. So if a buyer is purchasing within a trust, you will use the RCSD, representative capacity signature disclosure. What this does, if the buyer is purchasing in a trust, then the trust is the buyer. And the RCSD, since a trust is a pile of paper that you can't put a pen in its hand, right? The RCSD is the document that ties the person authorized to sign on behalf of that entity, the trust or the LLC, that the RCSD ties the actual signer to the buyer or seller, whichever it is. So let's say it's the Andrea Johnson Trust, and Andrea Johnson Trust is let's call it the seller of the property. The Andrea Johnson will execute an RCSD for sellers saying that I am the authorized signer for that trust, for the entity that's actually the seller. So it used to be that when you were going to sell a property, you had to take it out of your trust, or you couldn't buy in a trust. But that changed because there's a lot of tax implications on that, and taking the property out of the trust can result in tax liabilities that were not intended. So anyway, just had this come up also yesterday, where there was a misunderstanding on the part of the agent, thinking that because the trust was the seller, that the people who signed the RCSD, the actual owners of the trust or the trustees of the trust, were supposed to sign instead of their own personal signatures. They were supposed to sign the name of the trust, the Andrea, instead of me signing Andrea Johnson, I would be signing Andrea Johnson Trust, or whatever the name of my trust is, Andrea Johnson Family Trust. No, the RCSD is what makes you able to sign your actual name as the person signing. So the buyers and sellers use their own signature on, even if the seller is actually, even if the trust is the actual seller. I hope that made sense. Yeah, I've never encountered having had that misunderstanding before, but so I thought I would bring that up. We'll look at the RCSD. It looks like we're going to have some time to look at that later once we get through a little bit more of this. The joint escrow instructions to the escrow holder. This paragraph is just saying that this document and all of the addenda, counteroffers, and so forth that become part of this document because they have mutual agreement, those items collectively become the basis of the escrow instructions that the escrow holder is going to prepare. So, and the escrow holder will be generating those escrow instructions fairly close to immediately after escrow having been opened. Of course, in busy times, they may have, there may be a day or so delay. No, not okay. Okay, I have to sign back in. I don't know why that happened. Okay. I guess it thinks because I'm not typing things that I'm not actually actively using it. Okay. Okay, how do I get, I can't make the thing, maybe I can. Okay, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to take this opportunity to, we'll go back to the RPA, obviously, but let's take a look at the representative capacity signature disclosure since we were just on that topic. Okay, so this is for seller representatives. This is a disclosure to either the listing agreement or purchase agreement or some other agreement between principals. And then it's going to say in which blank is identified as seller, and this is going to be the name of the trust. Okay, that's the seller. The entity is the seller. Now, and it says if it's a trust, identify seller as the trustee of the trust or by the simplified name. Okay, so this is telling you that you're going to put in the name of the trust, and usually the full titled name of the trust would be whatever it is. Dated. Whenever it's dated. Okay, and that's usually I don't know why it won't let me put a space in there, but it's not seeming to like that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so you put in the full name of the trust. Obviously, if it were an entity like an LLC, you would check that box and check the appropriate box. It could be a power of attorney, or it could be an estate, conservatorship, guardianship, and then you would be putting in the court case number that named the person whose the property is being sold on behalf of. So the seller's representative represents that the trust entity or power of attorney for which that party is acting already exists, and they're also basically saying that they are the authorized signer for that trust. And then what's their title? Title is going to be trustee. Okay. So this is going to be done at the time of the listing. And if there are two, obviously put in the second seller. or the second signer. Pass it down. Is also a trustee. Okay. I just noticed successor trustee. This would be in the event that the original trustees are deceased. So this will be done at the time of the listing, whatever it's dated, and the agent will be signing this. Okay. Now, that's all you do at the time of the listing. Now, when you have a sale, you can use the same document to forward to the buyer side. And then buyer will also be signing that they've received a notice of this representative capacity signature disclosure. Now, in addition to this RCSD, in which basically the trustee or authorized person for the limited liability company or other corporation is signing, they have to have the escrow and title will require documents from the actual trust or LLC that show that this person who is named here is actually authorized by that entity to be the person signing on behalf of the entity. Okay. So this is a start, but it's not the full story, if that makes sense. Okay.
I'm showing them right now. Hey, Andrea,
Yeah.
they're asking if they could see the first page of the RCA. Oh, you have it up right now. The first page again.
Of RCSD?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, here it is. You can't see it?
Yeah. No, we can, but it was before you had put it up. So they had
Okay.
asked to see it again.
Okay. It's not an assignment. You're not assigning the contract. You're just saying that the seller is who holds the property. And in this case, it's the family trust. So that is the seller. This is the formal name of the trust. And then these are the trustees authorized to sign on behalf of the trust. I hope that. Are we ready to move along or?
I believe so. I don't see any other questions, so.
Okay. All right. Okay. Now let's bring back the RPA. Okay, all right. Okay, we're done with joint escrow instructions, but this is what the escrow officer is agreeing to when accepting the escrow, which they do at the bottom of page 10. Okay. Now, looking at, yes, question?
Andrea, question about the trust real quick. Does the trust have to be listed with the county as the owner?
Yes, if they're selling, it's whatever it shows as the owner of the property, and often it's going to be the trust. So yes. Otherwise, if the seller does not have the property in their trust and they want to sell through the trust, they'd have to get the property put into the trust and recorded as being in the trust. So just because they have a trust, if this property is not held within that trust, then the trust is not the seller of that property.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, remedies for breach of contract. Remember when we were talking on page 1 about limiting the amount of the earnest money deposit or initial deposit that is made at the time offer is accepted and placed into escrow. We limit that to 3%, and this is the paragraph that governs this. Paragraph 21 says that any clause added to the parties specifying a remedy such as a release or forfeiture of deposit or making a deposit non-refundable for failure of buyer to complete the purchase in violation of this agreement shall be deemed invalid unless the clause independently satisfies the statutory liquidated damages requirement set forth in the Civil Code. So liquidated damages, if the buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, and that does not mean exercising their contractual rights to inspect and decide to withdraw, or their contractual right to attempt to get a loan and then find out that their loan officer was incorrect in saying that they could obtain a loan for this property and they can't get the loan and their contingencies are not yet removed. So if buyer fails, that is not default. Default is, you know, we string you along, we remove our contingencies. Day 26, you know, we should be getting ready to fund the loan or sign loan documents, but guess what? The property we really wanted just came back on the market. Just kidding, we're not buying. That's default. In that scenario, then here comes the liquidated damages clause. If buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit actually paid. If the property is a dwelling with no more than 4 units, one of which buyer intends to occupy, then the amount retained shall be no more than 3% of the purchase price. Any excess shall be returned to buyer, except as provided in paragraph 14H. Release of funds will require mutual signed release instructions from both buyer and seller, judicial decision or arbitration award. Now, if, back to page 1, you were doing any increased deposit, buyer and seller shall sign a separate liquidated damages provision incorporating the increased deposit as liquidated damages. That's CAR Form RID. So if you do have a situation where for one reason or another, the buyer is putting down a smaller earnest money deposit with a promise to, at a certain number of days later, do an increased deposit. Let's say, you know, again, the example we talked about yesterday, the seller closes on their sale transaction and now has extra funds and to put in a more reasonable or acceptable earnest money deposit. The Form RID needs to be executed at the time the increased deposit, and that will incorporate the increased deposit into the into the liquidated damages clause. So this again is why we limit the amount of the earnest money or initial deposit to no more than 3%, because it's going to be returnable to the buyer anyway. This is also why sometimes, though, some buyers will want to put in less than 3%, because it is 3% or the deposit actually paid, essentially whichever is less. So some buyers will want to put in a lower earnest money deposit, but again, depending on the situation and how competitive it is to become the prevailing buyer for this particular property, a weak earnest money deposit is not going to be putting your best foot forward and saying, yeah, we really do want to buy this house. So you may not be the one that gets the nod if you show up with a paltry earnest money deposit. Or you may get countered. We want the full 3% earnest money deposit. Now, on to dispute resolution, and this is where paragraph 22A, mediation, the parties agree to mediate any dispute or claim arising between them out of this agreement or any resulting transaction before resorting to arbitration or court action through the CAR Real Estate Mediation Center for Consumers. Okay, so the CAR and our associations have mediators set up that we can go to. Now, the parties, it can also use any other mediation provider or service mutually agreed upon by the parties. I would recommend sticking with ones recommended by the associations. The parties also agree to mediate any disputes or claims with brokers who in writing agree to such mediation prior to or within a reasonable time after the dispute or claim is presented to the broker. Mediation fees, if any, shall be divided equally among the parties involved. If for any dispute or claim to which this paragraph applies, any party commences an action without first attempting to resolve the matter through mediation, or before commencement of an action refuses to mediate after a request has been made, then that party shall not be entitled to recover attorney fees, even if they would otherwise been available to that party. In any such action, this mediation provision applies whether or not the arbitration provision is initialed. So there are some exclusions, and those will be in 22C. So now you notice here in liquidated damages, 22B or 21B has to be initialed by all parties. So if you have two sellers and you get the your RPA back and only one has initialed liquidated damages, you need to get that followed up with and get both initials. All parties have to agree, and these are important paragraphs. They're optional. I personally have never done a transaction without everyone initialing both liquidated damages and arbitration clauses. But there may be cases in which someone does not want to initial arbitration in particular. Sometimes attorneys don't like to initial arbitration clauses. And others, but attorneys are notably, since they're advised in law school not to initial arbitration clauses. All my attorney clients have always initialed arbitration, however. So individually initialed, and all parties have to initial or it's invalid. So be very diligent in following up on that if the intention is to have liquidated damages and arbitration part of the agreement. Now, arbitration of disputes, and this is, basically they're yelling at us here. The parties agree that any dispute or claim in law or equity arising between them out of this agreement or any resulting transaction which is not settled through mediation shall be decided by neutral binding arbitration. The parties agree also to arbitrate any disputes or claims with brokers who in writing agree to such arbitration prior to or within a reasonable time after the dispute or claim is presented to the broker. Now, this is why we require the arbitration agreement to be included with our listing documents, because for some reason, Carr took this arbitration language out and the arbitration paragraph out of the listing agreement. So we require that you're going to be using it when you do a listing. You're going to use a separate Carr form, arbitration agreement form with a listing. But here it is in the RPA. It's already here, so we don't need to use an additional form. All right. Parties agree to arbitrate any disputes or claims with broker, blah, blah, blah. The arbitrator shall be a retired judge or justice or an attorney with at least 5 years of residential real estate law experience, unless the parties mutually agree to a different arbitrator. So it's setting standards here, not just Joe Blow that just got there, just passed the bar, for instance. The parties shall have the right to discovery, which is the same thing that happens in a court proceeding in accordance with the civil code set forth in that section of the civil code. In all other respects, the arbitration shall be conducted in accordance with Title IX of the Civil Code procedure, and judgment upon the award of the arbitrators may be entered into any court having jurisdiction. So enforcement of this agreement to arbitrate shall be governed by the Federal Arbitration Act. Exclusions from this arbitration, again, paragraph 22C. By initialing the space below, you are agreeing to have any dispute arising from this contract decided by neutral binding arbitration. You're giving up any rights in addition to have the dispute litigated in a court or jury trial. This is why sometimes attorneys are reluctant to initial or include this paragraph. But by initialing in the space below, you're giving up your judicial rights to discovery and appeal. So binding arbitration is final. There's no appeal process if you don't like the arbitration decision. Okay. You may be compelled to arbitrate under the authority of California Civil Code. Your agreement to this arbitration provision is voluntary. So once you initial it voluntarily, you are then compelled to use arbitration if mediation does not result in a satisfactory resolution. Okay. So this is additional mediation and arbitration terms. The exclusions: following matters are excluded from mediation and arbitration, and this would be a judicial or non-judicial foreclosure or other action or proceeding to enforce a deed of trust, mortgage, or installment land sale, as defined in the Civil Code section. An unlawful detainer action would be an exclusion, and that would be a tenant that has been refusing to comply with eviction process. Any matter that is within the jurisdiction of a probate, small claims, or bankruptcy court. So those things are excluded from the arbitration clause. Short list there. And then preservation.
And
Yes.
we did have a question. What happens, what is done when one of the parties refuses to initial?
So if one of the parties refuses to initial, you don't have an agreement. If there are 3 sellers, 2 of them initial and 1 of them doesn't, you don't have an agreement. Same with buyers. 2 buyers, one initials, 1 doesn't. If they don't agree to it, then you have to agree that you are proceeding without the arbitration clause being part of the agreement, and everyone needs to be so informed and in agreement with going forward with the purchase or sale without this paragraph being a part of the agreement. All that means then is if mediation were to fail in dispute resolution, the course of action would be litigation, which is time consuming, ties the property up with the lis pendens. It's much more expensive. So that's why a lot of people, or most people, like I said, including all my many attorney clients, have always assigned it. Then they always say, we're being bad attorneys. We know we're not supposed to sign this, but this is your corner of the world, and we know it's going to get handled. So if they don't initial, then you don't have, then this is not part of the agreement. So.
Thank you. And I know on the paperwork side, the file reviewers will note if there's no initials there. I think it's just, we need a note uploaded stating that they purposely skipped initialing it.
That's right. I guess it would be a subject of a counter offer, because if the buyer's initialed it going in and sellers are declining to initial it, it would be important to have a counter offer so stating that the arbitration clause shall not be part of the purchase agreement, and the reason for that is to make it clear that the seller is not agreeing to it, not just that we forgot, we missed an initial. Okay, so it
Yes.
really should be clarified.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there was one other question that's off topic of this, but do you ever recommend more than 3% to make offer more competitive?
Well, again, if you're using this is an excellent question. If you're using the liquidated damages clause, which we highly, highly recommend, otherwise all bets are off on what could be claimed in the event of a dispute. If you are using liquidated damages, and again, I never have not used liquidated damages, it's meaningless. An amount in excess of 3% is meaningless because the amount that would be at issue in the event of a dispute is going to be limited to 3% or the amount actually paid, whichever is less. So no, I don't recommend putting in more. a higher earnest money deposit. It doesn't strengthen your offer. It kind of, yeah. I've seen some really strange things for being put in for earnest money deposit, and it's going to be limited to 3% anyway. So I hope that answered the question.
It did, thank you.
Okay. All right. Preservation of actions. The following shall not constitute a waiver nor violation of the mediation and arbitration provisions. The filing of a court action to preserve a statute of limitations, filing of a court action to enable the recording of a notice of pending action, order for attachment, receivership, injunction, or other professional remedies, or the filing of a mechanics lien. Brokers shall not be obligated nor compelled to mediate or arbitrate unless they agree to do so in writing. Any brokers participating in mediation and arbitration shall not be deemed a party to this agreement. So we may participate for the purposes of discovery, clarifying what went on in the transaction from our perspective, but at no point are we actual parties to the agreement. Now we're going to cover some important but sort of more or less boilerplate things. Selection of service providers. We don't guarantee the performance of any vendors or service or product providers that we may recommend. All we can do is give our clients, hopefully, usually a list of people that we have worked with successfully, who other clients have been very happy with their work and their reports and so forth in the past. But we cannot guarantee that any human being that we recommended is infallible, and there could be omissions or mistakes made in your case. So we can't guarantee it. We can just help you. We can help you with making selections by recommending people we have known in the past to be reliable. This just talks about paragraph 24, multiple listing service. Brokers are authorized to report the results of the sale, put it in pending status once we have a contract, and report the terms of the sale to the MLS. Attorney fees in any action, proceeding, or arbitration between buyer and seller arising out of this agreement, the prevailing buyer or seller shall be entitled to reasonable attorney fees and costs from the non-prevailing buyer or seller, except as provided in 22A, again, which is where we talked about lost my train of thought here. Oh, I see what I'm back. My train of thought returned. So in the case where somebody initiates, without attempting mediation, initiates an arbitration or other sort of legal action, they're not entitled to attorney's fees. Okay.
Andrea, we just had a question pop over about home inspectors. Can you share the name or names of home inspector who will go back for a second look just before the VP?
Well, one that I know of and is used by some of the agents in our office, who will, and I think his fee is pretty nominal, and he tries to work it out within your timeframes. Of course, it would always be dependent on anyone's schedule, but it's Keith Silvas of Red Rock Home Inspections has done that for various agents that I work with. And I think the fee he's charged has been something like $100. And, you know, again, that would be entirely up to him, but it's something that you can check with him on. But I know most inspectors will, particularly the ones that are not part of large conglomerate companies. You know, they tend to have a little bit more flexibility to do those kinds of things. So Some repairs are, you can obviously go check yourself, and some you just, you know, you really don't have the ability to do. So it's, you know, I think it's helpful to have the inspector go out and verify it. Okay. Assignment, a buyer shall not assign all or any part of this buyer's interest in this agreement. Yes?
Gonna tell her. Oh, I'm sorry. I just was, they were saying, thank you, good to know.
Oh, okay. All right. Got it. Thank you. Okay. So buyer, you can't assign, buyer can't come in as Andrea Johnson and then say, oh, by the way, I'm going to hand this off to my son and he's going to actually complete the purchase. Whoever is on the contract is the person who is agreeing to complete the purchase. And this is important because we have had situations where people go in and get into contract on a property, and they don't really intend to close on the property. But what they do is they try and resell it themselves and have somebody, let's say they bought it for, I'm just going to use round numbers, 300. They believe the value is 330. And during the escrow period, what they attempt to do is sell it to somebody else for 330 and have that person close on the transaction, and they pocket the 30,000. So this is the reason for they can't just randomly do an assignment. That technically then is actually really the 30,000 that the should have gone into the actual seller's pocket. So buyer shall not assign all or any part of buyer's interest in this agreement without first having obtained the separate written consent of the seller to a specified assignee. Now, in that scenario, if the seller doesn't mind the person who's actually on the contract pocketing $30,000 of their money and agrees to let them assign it to whomever, who's going to close on it at 330 instead of 300, then if they have written agreement, then it can happen. But that consent shall not be unreasonably withheld. But any total or partial assignment shall not relieve the buyer of buyer's obligations to pursuant to this agreement. So let's say the seller agrees to allow someone to assign it, and maybe not even for additional compensation, but just allows the buyer to assign the contract to someone else. The original buyer who's on this contract is not relieved of the obligations of this contract, and their deposit could be at risk if the person they're assigning it to does not complete the transaction. Obviously, we're selling under the guidelines of equal housing opportunity. The terms and conditions of this offer, this is the agreed upon terms and conditions, or what the sale is occurring under. The liquidated damages paragraph or the arbitration of disputes paragraph is incorporated in this agreement if initialed by all parties, or if incorporated by mutual agreement in a counteroffer or addendum. If at least one but not all parties initial, a counteroffer is required until agreement is reached. Seller has the right to continue to offer the property for sale and to accept any other offer at any time prior to notification of acceptance. So again, back to the earlier question, what if one party doesn't? You have to doesn't initial arbitration or liquidated damage, either one of those paragraphs. You have to do a counteroffer process until the party that wants it incorporated says, okay, we'll go ahead without it being part of the contract, or the party that is refusing to initial says, okay, we'll allow it to be part of the contract, and that's all done in writing through the counteroffer process. Okay. And then this also covers the fact that any of the documents can be signed in counterparts, which means I sign this form, you sign this form, they're identical forms, but we both have signed the same form. And that's counterparts, instead of it all being both parties signing on one copy of the same form. Okay, time is of the essence. Entire contract and changes, time is of the essence. This means that any of the agreed upon timeframes are observed. All understandings between the parties are incorporated in this agreement. Its items are intended by the parties as a final, complete, and exclusive expression of their agreement with respect to the subject matter and may not be contradicted by evidence of any prior agreement. So whatever is here in writing, no matter what we talked about when you were, coming through my house and you kept asking me as the seller questions, about is this, that, or the other thing included, if it isn't in this agreement, it doesn't exist. Okay. So, and this brings up a frequent misconception. In the MLS, it says the refrigerator is included, but I didn't put it at paragraph 8. Well, why didn't you? Because if it's not here, it doesn't matter what the MLS says. It doesn't matter all the property features listed in the MLS if they're not fixtures of the property, and if that's not a built-in Sub-Zero or comparable refrigerator that's built in and is a fixture. No matter what the MLS says, if you didn't put it in this agreement, it's not included. And your client is going to, wonder why. And I'm going to say that you may be the one buying the refrigerator. So don't assume because it's in the MLS that it's part of the agreement. Okay. And then this says neither this agreement nor any provision in it may be extended, amended, modified, altered, or changed except in writing signed by buyer and seller. Okay. All right, so paragraph 30, important with definitions, talks about what acceptance, agreement, all of these things mean. The really important one here is days, and that's 30F, which says calendar days. However, after acceptance, the last day for performance of any act required by this agreement, including close of escrow, shall not include any Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, and shall instead be the next day. It used to be, we tried to set a date rather than number of days for close of escrow, because if you, are in negotiations and you don't get your acceptance until 3 or 4 days after you initially submitted the offer, and now 30 days from now falls on a Monday, which is going to be a legal holiday, we would have had to previously scramble and get it closed by Friday, which wasn't always the easiest thing to do. Either that or get an extension of time addendum signed by all parties. Now it just says if it falls on one of those days, you were supposed to close on 30 days from close of escrow, which happens to be a Saturday, it's going to, you don't have to get it closed by Friday. It's going to roll it forward to the next weekday that's a business day that's not a legal holiday. Okay. And then days after, this means a specified number of calendar days, not business days, after the occurrence of an event specified, but not counting the calendar date on which the specified event occurs, and it ends at 11:59 p.m. on the final day. So this refers back now, say for instance, to your notice to buyer to perform. The day that you're sending that notice doesn't count as one of the calendar days, so it would be 2 days after and expiring at 11:59 p.m. So the buyer, if you're asking for contingency removal, they don't do it by 11:59 p.m. on the second day. At 12:01 p.m. you can on the following day you can cancel the seller can send the cancellation if that's what they're inclined to do. Okay. Delivery is another important aspect. Unless otherwise specified in writing, the means shall be effective upon personal receipt by buyer or seller or the individual real estate licensee for that principle as specified. So personal delivery, what does that mean? There's been argument as to whether, say, something being faxed or emailed constitutes personal delivery. So we'll get into that in a minute here when we talk about confirmation of acceptance, which is our evidence of personal delivery. Let's look at the expiration of the offer. A mistake I see as often as not, probably literally about 50% of the time, I see that here, this offer shall be deemed revoked and deposit, if any, shall be returned to the buyer unless the offer is signed by seller and a copy of the signed offer is personally received by the buyer or by, put your name here. This is what authorizes you to receive seller's response and be the authorized agent for the buyer. Do not forget to put yourself in here. I'm sorry if I'm sounding like I'm on a soapbox, but it's because I'm on a soapbox. You can't believe how often I see this left blank. Now, that person now is authorized to receive it by 5 p.m. on the third day after this offer is signed by the buyer, or you can change the time frame. So the default for seller response is 5 p.m. on the third day after this has been signed by the buyer and hopefully conveyed the same day to the listing side. And if they want to change it up, the time frame, you would check here and say, let's say by 2 p.m. on whatever date. Okay, so let's say it was today, and we're going to say by 2 p.m. We want it by 2 p.m. on the 19th. Now, you'll frequently get people, maybe not frequently, but sometimes get people who say, let's make them respond by tomorrow at noon. You know, let's be tough, you know, or we're not buying it. We're out of here. You can't make them do anything. What you can make happen by 2 p.m. on the 19th is you can make your offer expire, or by noon tomorrow, you can make your offer expire by that time. You can't make them cancel everything they had going on in the next 24 hours and respond to your offer, you know. So all you're doing and succeeding in shortening that time frame up, in my opinion, most of the time is you are just making your offer expire, maybe sooner than you wanted it to. I usually leave it at the default of the third day after. There may be cases in which you legitimately really need an answer sooner. Let's say you have a buyer from the East Coast. They're here for a 3-day time frame, and they have to buy something while they're here, and they're going to be relocating. They want to be in contract and have their transaction rolling, so they have a place to move to once they get their relocation completed. So in that scenario, I would explain to the listing agent, hey, I'm not trying to be rude or pushy or overbearing here, but we've looked at 3 houses that are possibilities. Your listing is their top choice. We need to know if we can get it and go forward. Otherwise, we're going to need to move on to one of the others. You know, I'm not trying to pressure you, and I understand, you know, your circumstances may not be compatible with what our needs are, but we would like we need the response. If you can't do it, if you can't get back to us, then we'll need to move along to one of the other properties. Now, one or more buyers is signing this agreement in a representative capacity. Again, we looked at the RCSD. So if the buyer is purchasing in a trust, you're going to be including the RCSD with the purchase offer, with the buyer signing. As in that scenario, the buyer would actually be the Betty Buyer Family Trust, or whatever it is. And Betty Buyer would be signing the RCSD. Okay. If you're preparing the offer and you've noticed that the property county record shows that the property is held in the Andrea Johnson Family Trust, you don't check this because you're not the one filling out the RCSD for the seller. But what you are doing is you are checking to make sure when you receive the contract back or the counter offer back that you're get the RCSD. And actually, usually if it's seller multiple counter offer or even seller counter offer, they don't usually send the RCSD at that time. But once you have agreement, let's say they send you a counter offer and the buyer accepts it, then what you need to do is make sure that you are getting the RCSD that shows that Andrea Johnson is in fact the person who's signing on behalf of the Andrea Johnson Family Trust. So it's just some follow-up, but you're not going to check this now because this is seller's signature area. So at the time of writing the offer, you don't deal with that. Now, confirmation of acceptance. Let's say the seller accepts the offer as written. This now is going to go back to the buyer. It's all accepted. And then what happens is we need either the buyer or buyer's agent to initial here, confirming that they have been made aware that acceptance has occurred and we have formed a contract. So essentially, this is evidence of that personal receipt. Now, this is something that comes up sometimes as being a point of confusion. If the counter offer is issued and the buyer accepts the counter offer, then confirmation of acceptance is going to occur on the counter offer form, and it'll be the seller who is going to be acknowledging the receipt. That's if it's a regular, or I'm sorry, a confirming acceptance. So if it's a seller multiple counter offer where seller has to countersign in paragraph 8 and send that back saying of the multiple counter offers that were accepted by buyers, yours is the one we're selecting, then it goes back to the buyer to do confirmation of acceptance on that seller multiple counter offer. So it can get a little bit confusing and you sometimes have to stop and think it through. Okay. Broker box, you want this thoroughly completed. When you are, let's say the seller's brokerage firm was someone else. Remember I told you in that scenario, you need to go into the DRE website, find out, take Amy Agent's DRE number and put it in the verify a license search, and then get their broker ID number. And then at the same time, get the broker's address and information and fill out all of this information for the agent so that it's done and it's complete. It just makes you look like a strong agent who dots I's, crosses T's, and pays attention to details. It's also essential information for all parties to have. Who is this broker? Where are they located? Telephone number should be the agent's cell phone number and agent's email, the individual agent, not the brokerage. And then, of course, page 10, this is where escrow holder acknowledges that they are accepting the escrow and that they are going to be now bound by the terms of the escrow or of this RPA for as defined what their duties are as the escrow holder. And then buyer's inspection advisory. This is just a little synopsis of some of the kinds of inspections a buyer of real property in the state of California may wish to obtain as part of their purchase decision process. We also have the form SBSA, statewide buyer and seller advisory, which is 14 pages of different kinds of inspections a buyer may wish to obtain. And usually buyers receive that as part of the seller disclosure package most of the time. Some agents want to put it in with the offer. I think a lot of listing agents don't want 14 more pages of items at the time they're working on negotiating an offer before they've even come to an accepted offer. And then this last disclosure, the California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, which was recently added to the RPA package. So, questions?
Okay, I have one question here. If you, buyer agent, reduce expired time and they respond after, is RPA acceptance still valid from seller?
This is an excellent question. I'm so glad you asked this. Okay, so let's say you get your response after 5 p.m. on the third day after the offer is signed. And not very many people know this and not very many people do this, but really, a point on the counter offer needs to be, point one on the counter offer should be, and if you are the listing agent responding after the expiration of the time frame, point one on your counter offer should be, per paragraph 31, response time for buyer's offer is extended to whatever the date and time is. So let's say you're not responding till the 5th day. So here it is. What day is this? The 17th. You're not responding until the 22nd. And you can even build in a cushion just in case you need it. But point one on the counter offer should be, response time for buyer's offer shall be extended to June 22nd at 6 p.m. or whatever is the applicable time frame. A lot of people don't do that. They just tender the offer anyway. It doesn't seem to upset anything, but really it's an expired offer that's invalid. Really, if you want to get super technical about it. So.
Okay, that was our only question I had.
Okay, I think we have a few minutes. Let's take a quick look at the notice to buyer to perform. Which apparently I need to add. Something that may be obvious to those with experience who are participating, but not I frequently get it from agents who don't have experience. When you see a particular form that comes up, like we just saw, there were 3 notices to buyer to perform. I'll frequently get from newer agents a question, which one do I use? Which one do I use? They're all the same. They're duplicates. The reason there's 3 of them that you may select from is that you may need to use more than one during the course of the transaction. Same with the addendum forms and so forth. So there's a number of forms that there's multiple copies of the same form. So I usually just take them and put them in sequential order as they show up on the documents list. So notice to perform, whichever one this is, maybe it's number 1. And between the parties, it's part of the conditions of the residential purchase agreement. And we're going to specify now what contractual action we are requesting them to take. Again, this seems to be most frequently used for the contingency removal. And depending on where you are in the transaction, hopefully, if it's number 1, you're going to be dealing with, hopefully within 17 days, you want the appraisal contingency removed. You want any contingency pertaining to the disclosures and reports. We want the contingency for buyers' investigations. We probably already received the title report. So you can check them off individually, which contingencies you're requesting to be removed, or if it's a contractual action such as an initial deposit or increased deposit, or the CAR form FVA, which is the FHA-VA amendatory clause, or they haven't provided their lender letter, or verification of proof of funds, all of these things. You can use this form to compel them to take the contractual action, or put the ball in the seller's court for cancellation. So basically this says, if you do not remove the specified contingencies or take the specified contractual actions indicated above within 2, or you can't change whatever was in the contract here. You can't, if you didn't change the default, which is 2 days in the contract, you can't just suddenly change it here. So, and if you do, you're issuing an invalid notice to perform, which they can tell you to pound sand, and you're going to have to do it again, and thereby extending your time frames. So don't just make something up here. It's whatever the contract said. If it was changed to 3 days in the contract, you can change it to 3 days here, but you can't suddenly say, 1 day or 0 days or something like that. So you're being essentially put on notice that if you do not remove the specified contingencies or take the specified contractual action within the 2 days after delivery, but no less, as it says here, than the time specified in the agreement of this notice to perform, seller may cancel the agreement. It doesn't say it is canceled. It just says now the ball's in the seller's court, and if the seller wants to check in with their backup offer and see if they're still in the game and boot you out and put them in, seller is within their contractual rights to do that. So again, time is of the essence. Now, confirmation of receipt on this, the seller is the one signing this to send this forth to the buyer. Very seldom do you get confirmation of receipt back from the buyer on this. I mean, most people look at the notice to perform as a personal insult. It's not. It's just business, and it's just complying with the terms of the contract. But it's not very common for an agent to put hurt feelings aside and take care of the contractual confirmation of receipt. And so don't, all I'm saying is they're supposed to confirm receipt of it. Don't be surprised if they don't. So when I'm delivering something like this, I text the agent, I email the agent, and I send this via email. I also leave a voicemail message and let them know. So there can be no question that they were put on notice that if they missed it in their email, they got it via text, and they got it via voicemail from me or phone conversation from me. And if I do a phone conversation, actually get the person and let them know I'm sending this, have a phone conversation with them, I follow that up with an email that serves as something of a memorandum of understanding for our recent phone conversation. I have sent along the notice to buyer to perform. Thank you for your attention to this matter, something of that nature. Okay.
Andrea,
Yes.
who, if anyone, initials the box at the bottom of the forms that says reviewed by broker or designee?
Excellent question. That is our file review person. It's not anyone that's in the transaction. So don't be putting your initials there. Anything else?
Nope, but that's all the questions I have.
Okie dokie. Well, thank you for being here, for participating, and your commitment to getting your skills tuned up. And any questions, you can direct them to us at Broker Support. You can contact me directly as well. I'll be happy to help you ferret through the twists and turns that come up with your transactions and your preparation to get into transactions. And I guess we're done.
Sorry, Andrea, no questions here. We're good to go.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm signing off.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Now you got everybody's attention.